Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, guys, whether you're watching us on YouTube or on Rumble. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Dr. Diesen. He is a Norwegian political scientist, professor at the University of Southeast Norway, and a geopolitical analyst. And recently, he also published the book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Dr. Glenn, it's a really pleasure to have you back on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to see you again.
Thank you so much. Actually, when I was trying to prepare for this conversation with you, I remembered my university days when I was 23, 22 years old. I was doing my master degrees in Beirut, and many of the professors, let's say the academics in university, they jumped the wagon of the Arab Spring and they were promoting for the democratic movements, let's say, in the region. And a similar pattern that I saw happened after February 2022 when the war, or let's say the hot war in Ukraine erupted and Russia invaded Ukraine. And in this case, I realized that very few academics like yourself was questioning, let's say, the narratives, the mainstream narratives, or pushing against some of the war narratives in this case. And in my humble opinion, correct me if I'm wrong, I realized that academia there are forces trying to hijack academia as well and trying to establish a parallel intelligence apparatuses from academia in order to justify the war efforts of some of the countries, especially when it comes to important geopolitical conflicts such as in Ukraine. I mean, in your case, how do you explain the alignment between the war machine in Ukraine and some of these academics? And have you yourself were challenged and faced some difficulties in your academic career because of your opinions in this case? How difficult it is for a professor and an academic like yourself to continue operating and working in this environment?
Well, I think there's very little dissent in academia, and unfortunately, academics often can become almost spokesper people for government policy. Now, I don't think there's a great conspiracy behind it. I think it's just in human nature. That is, human beings, when we fear external threats, we have a tendency to seek security in the group. So we demand in-group loyalty and we punish dissent. And this is what we see during conflict. Now, the problem is in academia, it's supposed to be the pursuit of truth and challenge established ideas through scientific methods. So what we often see in academia is a huge pressure on scholars, also in political science. And I think this is deeply problematic because my main approach within political realism, but indeed with both the main theories in international politics, is you have to take the point of departure has to be the security competition. That is, states compete for security. So, for example, in my PhD, I focused on the security dilemma. So both sides undermine each other's security in the effort to increase their own. Now, what I quickly discovered is once you discuss how, for example, Russia threatened our security, it's all fine and well. But once you talk about how we threaten Russian security, suddenly you're met with a lot of criticism because this is where ideology is also dangerous, because we tend to frame everything as us versus them, good versus evil, and then suddenly we can't even talk about security competition. So I think this is the main where the main problem comes in. That and this makes it impossible to say anything about international politics, because if you want to resolve crisis, you have to also address how we threaten the security of others. So, if, for example, look at this Ukraine crisis. If you're not allowed to discuss how NATO has threatened Russian security over the past 30 years, how can you possibly even discuss to talk?
Yes.
The only thing you can say then is, Putin is Hitler, or Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union. Everything happens in a vacuum if we're going to ignore our own role. So yes. I think this is why it becomes very difficult to censor academics. So we definitely have that. Well, I'm in Norway, and we have state-financed human rights organizations who come after you, and funded by National Endowment for Democracy, of course, who come after you if you break with the NATO narrative, if you will.
This is something that I noticed. For example, I was so young when the invasion of Iraq happened, but I still remember when they used to call him the Hitler of the century, and then it was about Gaddafi, and then it was Assad, the Hitler of the 21st century, and now it's Putin. Is this approach, let's say, coming from only an ideology, or there is also political wishful thinking behind it? Like the academia has been weaponized, let's say, to achieve political ends in other countries, whereas the role of academia is completely something different, right?
Well, I think the academia has become much more ideological, but a lot of it comes from a genuine place as well. Because in the 90s, there was great enthusiasm across the West that the world would be fundamentally transformed with liberal democratic ideas. That is, we could change the way states behave. But the dark side of this coin is once you begin to believe in this that conflicts are decided by good versus bad values. Now all conflicts are good versus evil. By implication, there is no negotiation anymore. Why would you compromise your good values by making compromise with bad values? And this is why we don't have diplomacy anymore. And this assumption that peace only derives from defeating the adversary. And this Hitler analogy, I mean, it's not just Saddam Hussein. Every adversary is a reincarnation of Hitler. We did this with Milosevic, Saddam Hussein. Putin is new Hitler. Xi Jinping is new Hitler. Even in domestic politics now, Trump is Orange Hitler, and it's quite interesting because the whole what do they say if you say, well, let's at least not negotiation, let's at least have diplomacy with our adversaries, sit down and talk to them. No, but you can't talk to Hitler because that's called appeasement. No, he has to be defeated. So everything is military conflicts. As NATO Secretary General would suggest, weapons are the path to peace. Sitting down and talking is giving them legitimacy. We can't do that. Yes. So this is the warlike mentality, and this is the dark side of the ideology which we so enthusiastically built our political system around now.
Yes, speaking of weapons and diplomacy, I think this was 2 weeks ago, maximum 3 weeks ago, Zelensky was stating like, yeah, maybe we have to talk to Russia, we have to settle this conflict in Ukraine. And then all of a sudden, we woke up with the incursion of the Ukrainian armed forces into the Russian territories this time. And the Russians are perceiving this in a completely different manner because the equipment, the training, and everything of the Ukrainian armed forces are from the NATO countries. So from the political and military perspective in Russia, they see it as a NATO invasion inside Ukraine, inside of Russia itself. So after Kursk, we saw Putin. Now he was in Chechnya. Correct me if I'm wrong. This was the first visit of him since 2011. Some people say that they are planning on shifting the military operation of Russia in Ukraine from a special military operation into declaring a war against Ukraine. Do you see that Russia is headed toward this option now, like an all-out war against Ukraine, destroying the Kiev regime, or still they're going to practice more self-restraint in this case?
Well, I don't think any decisions have been made, at least not that I'm aware of. But this is something you hear rumors about, but it's also something you see within the Russian media. They're talking more about why are we having a special military operation? We've been invaded now, and this is not just part of the Ukrainians retaliating. As you pointed out, they consider this to be an invasion by NATO, and this is not unreasonable. If you look at NATO, is the one who obviously provided all the training, the weapons, the intelligence. They're part of the military planning. They help to manage some of the complex weapon systems. What is it exactly they don't do? And so, the Americans try to take some distance by suggesting they didn't know about this invasion. But I find that very hard to believe, given that the US had a large administrative control over Ukraine for the past decade. So, and at least now in the execution of this invasion of Russia, all the satellite imagery, all of this, in the intelligence they get from the Americans, I think it's very hard to suggest that this came out of the blue and the West hasn't got anything to do with it. Even if you see the German and British political and military leadership, they're referring to the successes in the invasion of Russia as a reason to send more weapons. This is something we have to support. So yes, in my opinion, NATO did contribute to the invasion of Russia. So this is why there's now real discussions whether or not to just upgrade this to a proper war, and that would also impact the way the war is fought. And I think we're reaching that point. I think the Russians have tried to be restrained because, keep in mind, if they retaliate, especially directly against NATO, we do risk World War III with nuclear exchange. But if they don't retaliate, what do we see? Continued gradual escalation. And indeed, this is the point Zelensky made. Look, he told, he gave a speech. He said, look to NATO, we invaded Russian territory. This, image of this big, scary Russian giant, which we can't really, trespass its red lines. This is all a myth. So we proved this. You can join in on the fight now. Do strike Russia more directly. Let us get these long-distance weapons to strike deep inside Russia. I mean, deeper inside Russia. We're already greenlighting this. So Russia is under huge pressure now. Do you either risk retaliation and nuclear war, or do you embolden NATO and allow them to effectively have NATO attacking Moscow in a few weeks' time without responding? Because both of these are risk, and this is the point we're currently at.
This is the same dilemma that Iran has, right? They have to respond now against Israel to reestablish deterrence. And at the same time, if they respond in a harsh way to restore deterrence, this is going to be Iranians running into the trap of the Israelis. They want for Iran to retaliate in a harsh way to drag in the Americans in the region, because the Israelis are going to even retaliate even harsher against Iran. And in this case, I see it as the same strategy, that the Ukrainians are basically telling the Russians, what are you going to do about it? We are going to conduct a military operation inside your territory. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to bomb or attack or target the NATO forces, the NATO advisors in this case? Are you going to cause World War III? Are you going to attack us with tactical nuclear weapons? What are you going to do about it? So this is a similar dilemma that the Russians are in, that if they don't respond, it's a win for Ukraine. And if they respond, it's going to be a huge conflict, which is very irresponsible. And the other day I was arguing this with someone who completely disagrees with me. And I said, people have to be grateful that there is reasonable and rational leaders in Russia and in China. Otherwise, we would have been now in a hot conflict between NATO and Russia, right?
Yeah, and this is a bit of an irony, because we always refer, the crazy mullahs in Iran or the irrational, angry Putin, but this is, but you see in reality there's a lot of caution and the reason behind this, but it also demonstrates that this is acts of desperation. If you look at what happened to Israel, they really got stuck now in Gaza. They're struggling, and then of course they have this new front with Hezbollah. And they see the only way to really get out of this if they bring in the Americans, which is why they're doing this kind of drastic things by attacking Tehran during presidential inauguration. And it's the same with Ukraine. Their army has been exhausted over the past 2.5 years. They run out of manpower, they run out of the NATO weaponry, and they're on their last leg. So you have this very risky adventure they've gone into now, but they're also escalating. I mean, why would you attack, for example, the Russian early nuclear warning system, which has no purpose on the battlefield? Why would you keep striking a nuclear power plant? Why would you invade Russian territory? Why? All of these things, they are very obviously intended to escalate the conflict. And this is what the Belarusian president said as well. I mean, Lukashenko, one doesn't have to take him on the word of everything, but he made this argument that perhaps Zelensky wouldn't mind if Russia dropped a tactical nuclear weapon on them, because this would then compel greater involvement by the NATO countries. So I'm not saying he's correct, but it brings up an interesting point. We have to assess the interest of someone to escalate. And I think this is why Iran is cautious, because as you pointed out, they know Israel is trying to pull the Americans in. And this is also why Russia is cautious. My main concern with this is that we're using the reason and caution on not just Iranian side, but on the Russian side, as a way to effectively conclude that they do not defend the red lines anymore, so we can escalate further. But we have to accept the Russians are in this dilemma, and if you push them too far, they will do something. And just briefly, this was also hinted as an argument by the former head of Russian analysis at the CIA, it's George Beebe. He had this interview back in December of 2021, where he was pointing out, listen, if we continue down this path, the Russians will at some point invade, because well, the Americans keep entrenching themselves more and more in Ukraine. It's either now or never. They don't want to go into Ukraine. This is what the CIA director pointed out as well. But if we continue to push this, they will see us having no other option. And I think this is the same now. Russia will retaliate. This idea we can just bomb them and nothing, they won't retaliate ever, because the deterrent of NATO is so scary. I mean, this is really insanity. I mean, I trust more the rationality now coming from the Kremlin than Washington, because Washington seems to have, well, actually Washington seems to be a little bit more pragmatic. From the British side especially, they seem to have definitely lost their mind, because the Americans are pulling a little bit back on the British, telling them to calm down, apparently. So.
Yeah, I think the Russians have multiple choices and many cards to play here. For example, in Syria, 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago, we've seen the tribal forces conducted a surprise attack against American occupation forces there. And the Syrian army artillery has paved the way for them to advance in territories occupied by the US occupation forces. And this was, in my opinion, something wasn't really possible without a Russian cover, like without a Russian encouragement. So they have their cards to play to harm the American presence in other parts of the world. People maybe expect a reaction from the Russian side, but the Russians do not really act on reactions, but they plan on what they can do in this case. And they're trying to really avoid a World War III scenario in this case. You mentioned the attack of the Ukrainian side against the early nuclear radar systems, the alarm systems of Russia. And I was reading the nuclear doctrine of Russia, and I'm paraphrasing it. In one of the segments, they mention clearly that anything that jeopardizes Russia's ability to deter a nuclear attack against the country, it would require Russia to respond in a nuclear manner against its opponents, and means these radar systems, these early alarm systems, are part of Russia's capacity, military capacity or capability to detect a nuclear attack and respond accordingly. So when that's jeopardized, they could respond in a nuclear manner. And this was really, really dangerous provocation, in my opinion, in this case. And in parallel, we have other things happening in Ukraine. For example, this week, the Ukrainian parliament adopted what they called a historic law banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which the Kiev government has accused of complicity in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Could you please explain the significance of this move and why Kiev felt necessary to ban the Orthodox Church and replace it, I think, with a newly established church called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which was recognized only in 2019, right?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just respond to what you first talked about, this escalations, because I think it's important to realize how the conflict's intensifying, because we have we effectively have to reinvent the rules of proxy wars, because all the previous rules have now been broken. So the way that the NATO escalates is usually through this incrementalism. They do just gradual steps. We saw this with NATO expansion, with missile defense. They just gradually did more and more missiles closer to Russian borders. And of course, they did the same to Ukraine ever since 2014, but also after 2022. Just first, send some lighter weapons, then some heavier weapons, more and more long range, get deeper and deeper involved, and then they kind of test it. And if Russia didn't mind one missile hitting inside its border, why not two? If it doesn't respond after 50 kilometers inside, how about 100? So there's always this gradual incrementalism to slowly push through red lines. Now, the Russians, their main response is, because they don't want to trigger World War III, obviously, they need plausible deniability, because keep in mind that the Americans don't want to hit, if they don't want to retaliate if Russia retaliates against them. Neither side wants nuclear war, so they have to give the American an out in order not to feel compelled. In other words, if the Russians bomb New York, the Americans have no choice; they have to respond. Then you have World War IIIs. But you look for ways you can retaliate, which is obvious that it's you, but you don't necessarily take responsibility, which means that the message has been received, but there's not so much pressure to go further up the escalation ladder. So we see this with Russia. They probably, given there's a lot of new attacks now on American occupation forces in Syria and Iraq. So obviously, I assume that some of the intelligence or weaponry or anyways, the green lighting comes from Moscow as well. Russia said this openly. They will start to supply weapons now to any country who are fighting against the West, and they send to make their deals with the North Koreans. They sell their ships to Cuba, and there's also these different sabotage missions across Europe and I think the US as well, in which malls or weapons factories have been burned. I'm not saying that the Russians are necessarily behind it, but I think there's a good probability that. So this is the horizontal escalation. So they will find other way of bringing pain to the West as a retaliation as we continue to escalate. So there is, in this way, we can continue to escalate both sides without necessarily triggering world war. But this is, of course. You can only take it so far before there's a direct clash.
Yes.
Anyways, sorry about that. Regarding the Orthodox Church, sorry, now I forgot your question already.
No, actually, I realized that they banned the Russian. They call it a Russian Orthodox Church, and they call it a historic law. And they say that this church was complicit in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they want to give or replace it with a new church that they recognized only in 2019. It's called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I would like to know the significance of this move from the Ukraine side, that they want to ban this church. This church probably has hundreds of thousands of followers in Ukraine itself, and this will definitely alienate them and probably even push them in to become Russians. It's like alienating Ukrainians to join the Russian Federation and apply for Russian citizenship, like many people did in the Donbass.
Yeah, so back in 2019, there was a huge support from the United States for this, by the way. If you looked at the think tanks, Atlantic and all, they had all these articles which came out that, the Orthodox Church is effectively cultural arm of Russia, and it's something that keeps Russia influence still in Ukraine. And this is, on the face of it, it's not an unreasonable argument to make. So if they want to completely sever themselves from Russia, then they have to also split from the Orthodox Church, create their own. And if that's not that's probably where they should have stopped. But if that's not enough, then begin to ban the Russian church as well. In other words, nationalize the religion and decouple from Russia. This is the biggest problem of the nationalist movement in Ukraine. If you lived hundreds of years in the same state as Russia, how do you decouple when it's effectively a bilingual state, bicultural, and it becomes very deeply problematic. So. And I think this is, as you suggested, it's in the West, people often support it. They get excited, especially Washington, because this is a way of really de-Russifying Ukraine. But as you point out, we forget that these are also actually Ukrainians, and we're actually breaking down their society. And this is something that also impacted negatively their ability to fight war, because now it's banning this Russian Orthodox Church by calling it like an agent of Russia. But they did this after the coup as well. They started putting ban on Russian language. They began to ban Russian-friendly media, books, political parties,
language.
and anyone who didn't align properly were purged. And this always had to go this direction. I mean, if you have majority of people speaking Russian in the country and you say this is an imperial legacy, now you have to purge this legacy. Now, the problem is that the majority of Ukrainians, or at least a huge portion of Ukrainians, become second-rate citizens now. Now, this has deep problems. For one, it becomes a deep source of social conflict in Ukraine. Even among allies, look at especially American Republicans. Many of them would probably start to refer to this. Why are we sending billions of dollars to a country which is essentially attacking a key pillar of Christianity? And also within Russia, of course, this is going to intensify Russia's objectives, because Russia's concerns are twofold. And this was also pointed out by the CIA director William Burns back in 2008. And the first is if you're going to have Ukraine aligned only with NATO, like move away from Russia only to the West, they have to purge a huge part of their ethnic and Russian-speaking population. And second, it means NATO in Ukraine, which is an existential threat to Russia. So what do you do now if you're going to ban the Orthodox Church? Of course, Russia's going to have more demands on Ukraine to end the war. So they're going to maybe now pursue regime change as well, because they can't accept this ban on the Russian Orthodox Church. It's seen as being unacceptable. So it's I think it's even if you support this war and you would like NATO to crush Russia, all of this, how does this make any sense? You're creating internal divisions in Russia, in Ukraine. You're intensifying the resentment of Russia, and you're pushing allies away. I mean, this just seems like a very foolish idea, but it's feeding the extreme nationalist base within Ukraine, and the nationalists have a lot of power in Ukraine, exactly because the Americans wanted them to.
Yeah. I have read some arguments on social media, one of which that I would like to share with you about banning the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And some people say that in the West is the collective West is an empire. It's headed by the United States, and any empire has set up, it has a political system that they're exporting and also set of values. And now in 2024, one of the values that the collective West is prioritizing is the LGBTQ, transgenderism, and the set of values that they are pushing now in kindergartens, in education systems, in sex education, etc., etc. There is a certain encouragement for this set of values. And even the church here, for example, in the Pride Week, for example, I was just by an accident passing next to a church here. It's a Catholic church. And I just saw the priest was outside of the church with his followers, or with the people outside, carrying the LGBTQ plus flag, including the priest. So some people say that the Orthodox Church in this case is still a shield against this type of values. For example, the Orthodox Church in Russia, the Orthodox Church in Syria, in Armenia, and elsewhere. So there has to be, they have to destroy this type of resistance against the set of values that the collective West is trying to promote and spread around the world. Therefore, they have created a different Christian Orthodox Church, let's say in Ukraine in this case. And the Russians are saying now, for the Europeans, for the Westerners, guys, if you want to run away from wokeism, come to Russia. We are the antidote for this lifestyle that they are trying to promote in the West. So this is also two camps that represent different set of values. Therefore, it was necessary in Ukraine to destroy the Orthodox Church of what they call Russia in order to also destroy the resistance against this type of values. How do you see this argument? Do you see also this is about values in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I don't think they're going to be able to destroy the Orthodox Church, by the way. I think this is only going to further increase social splits, just like the language. I mean, I watched a lot of Ukrainian Telegram channels of men on the front, and they're making this video saying, listen, I'm here defending the front lines for Ukraine, even though this country considers me to be a second-rate citizen because I speak Russian. And so this is something very deep-seated, and something alienating millions of their own people was kind of stupid if you're trying to unify the country in a war, by the way. But I think the main objective for the United States is simply to de-Russify, to decouple Ukraine as much from Russia as possible, just from pragmatic reasons, irrespective of the misery and pain it brings to Ukrainians. Again, this has never been about helping Ukraine. Ukrainians are a convenient tool, an instrument, a dagger in the side of Russia. That's the main purpose. But beyond this, I wouldn't dismiss, of course, that there's a wider conflict of values at stake. I mean, I made the point often that liberalism in the West, it seems to have begun, the liberal nation state, it's been dismantled to some extent because liberalism has begun to decouple itself from the nation state. This is gone back to be a very long debate whether or not, because a lot of the liberal ideas introduced in the French Revolution also came up under nationalism.
Yes.
And the main idea is that for liberalism to be pure, it have to separate itself from this nationalist impulse, because nationalism, it communicates a lot of the pre-modern, the tradition, religion, essentially, the instinctive humanity, which was pre-modern. Anyways, my point is simply that you see already this happening in the West. This idea, we're not just secular anymore. There is a very radical secularism where it's not just the division between state and church, but the church should ideally be shamed to the corner of society, and this is like one group in society you're allowed to mock and discriminate, not have tolerance for, at least. And
Yes.
I think a good example, many people of course look towards this, everyone's obviously seen this Olympic opening in Paris, and of course this can be seen as being just one example, but it does represent something wider, which is this idea in the culture that we're developing this new cosmopolitanism, this new universalism, which is completely divorced from the traditional and the particular or the unique with one culture, and you're trying to bring together this new cosmopolitan ideas based on universal ideals. Now, obviously, as I pointed out, if this is based on transgenderism and this transsexual smurfs they had there, all of this weirdness, I don't think mocking Christianity and all is necessarily universalism, but there is obviously a culture war going on in the West at the moment, and I think I think before we intensify this on the Western side, first of all, I wonder if it's good for our society. Well, I don't wonder. I'm pretty sure this is very negative for our societies. But also, I don't think we would necessarily win such a culture war against Russia. I think during the Cold War, when it was Christianity versus the atheist communist, I think there was within that limitation, I think right was on our side effectively. But in this, I think some of the values we are pushing, they are there's something decadent about it, especially
against human instincts. I truly believe that many people, I just want to give very quickly an example of the son of a very good friend of mine who was born and raised in a very secular family. He wasn't introduced to any religion. He doesn't know what religion is. He doesn't know anything about Christianity, about Islam, he just grew up with nothing. He was set. They taught him set of values: not to steal, not to kill, not to do this and that. But he grew up as a good person. And when he turned 14 and in the school, he realized that they're pushing transgenderism, identity politics, and they are normalizing it in a very and shaming people who are not accepting it, basically, right? And his friend, he was yesterday a boy, today a girl. So this confusion and everything confused the boy, and he was only 14, and he decided to become a Muslim because he found it as a shield against these types of ideas. So what I'm saying is sometimes a person like him, for example, who was not exposed to any religion, he realized that this is against his human instinct, and he wanted to shield himself against it. He's not radicalized against them. He just wants to shield himself personally against this idea. So he picked Islam as a religion to shield himself against this. Now, if I want to move with you a little bit to the south of Russia, to Azerbaijan, to the Caucasus, I would like to show the audience this article published on Association Press quickly. And this is coming from yes, this is the Association Press. They say, day after Putin's visit, Azerbaijan applies to join Russia and China in the BRICS alliance. Azerbaijan formally applied Tuesday to join the BRICS bloc for developing countries, a day after Russian leader Vladimir Putin's visit to the oil-rich South Caucasus country to shore up regional ties and secure Moscow's, quote, under pressure trade routes. The announcement from the foreign ministry in Azerbaijan's capital Baku comes as the BRICS alliance has seen a major expansion. For over a decade, the bloc included just five nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Iran Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates joined in January, and Saudi Arabia has said it is considering doing so as well. The club already includes some of the world's biggest oil producers and accounts for well over a quarter of the world's GDP. Its members, Russia and Iran, have had their relations with the West stretched to breaking points over Moscow's war on Ukraine and Iran's regional policies. Now, when I see Azerbaijan intentions to join BRICS, the question that comes to my mind is Armenia, because I'm ethnic Armenian. And I ask myself what Armenia is doing in this case. Armenia is completely shifting towards the West. And in Arabic, we say there is a quote that says "Yitamak al-Hajj when nas raja," means like you're going to Mecca for a Hajj when everybody is returning from Mecca. It's like EU and NATO. It's like they're in decay now, and this is the time that Armenia picked to join the NATO camp, right? It's like even realistically and rationally, it doesn't make sense. Whereas Azerbaijan is diversifying the relationship, and Armenians are. They can call Aliyev a dictator, they can call him this and that, but he's outsmarting Pashinyan in this case by having good relations with the East and the West, whereas Armenia is becoming, I don't know if you agree with me, it's turning itself into pawn against Russia in this case, and this is going to end in a disastrous manner for the Armenian nationhood. I don't know what's your take on this about Azerbaijan and Armenia.
No, I think Pashinyan's played the card very foolishly because they have two good friends in the region, which was Russia and Iran, and turned their back on both of them, and by doing so also strengthened the hand of Azerbaijan and Turkey, which were the main two adversaries. And why did it do this? As you suggested, it would be one of those few stories where the mice jump onto a sinking ship, but even if the West was not in a relative decline, if you're looking to bet on the winning horse, it's still worth noticing what is the American interest in Armenia. There's first of all, there's very little ability to project that much power into that region, but also not just the capabilities, but you have to assess the intention. And it's quite obvious what the Americans are after. They see Armenia as a way of weakening Russia. I mean, should read this Rand papers of how to extend and weaken Russia. And, a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan would be a positive thing, according to these reports. But why? Because Russia attempts to have good relations with both. They don't have good relations with each other. If you can have a conflict between them, Russia would have to, choose one or the other. It didn't choose either, but that meant that Pashinyan could say, the Russians aren't helping us, they're not protecting us. But in all fairness, he already said that this was not Armenian territory at that time. So there was not that much Russia should go and defend territory, which Pashinyan said is not even ours. It makes it very difficult. So no, I think Armenia hasn't played its cards very well at all. And it is being used as a pawn. And it's worth looking at other countries in the region where this has happened. Not just Ukraine, which is in the war, but also the Georgian experience. If you listen now to the prime minister of Georgia, they recognized that in 2008 that they were pushed in or lured into a conflict with Russia, and they're also arguing now that the Americans are yet again trying to topple the government so they can use the Georgians as a second front. And if they would be successful, you can be sure every Western media would be full of arguments how we're standing by Georgia and helping them. But it would be the same story. We're using them as a second front to be sacrificed. They will be the new Kurds, to be used, bled dry, and then thrown away once they have served their purpose. So I think it's a strange time for Armenia to break with Russia and empower its adversaries. And why? For America, which doesn't have the capability to project power, and its intentions are, well, let's say, dubious at best. So
I 100% agree with you. And to be honest, this is something also emotional for me because 100 years ago, we had 1.5 million people of 1.5 million of our people perished because of the genocide. And I think now, after the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, this could be the last war. If Azerbaijan wages a war against Armenia and without a protector for Armenia in this case, regional protectors such as Iran and internationally Russia, they could be smashed. And I think there should be no one in Armenia with two functioning brain cells who would would believe that Macron or Trudeau or Biden, they're going to come and save Armenia if there is war between Azerbaijan and Armenia in this case. It's very sad to see what's happening in Armenia, and it's sadder to see how big is the American embassy in Yerevan. I don't know if you have seen the American embassy in Armenia. It's bigger than a military compound. I don't know. It's the entire neighborhood that I live in here. It's smaller than the American embassy. What are they doing there? And what are they planning for? And all these NED, USH, source organizations, they're spawning like everywhere. If there is a law like in Georgia, the foreign agent law, like they adopted in Georgia, the results will be shocking in Armenia. You will see probably over 90% of these organizations are funded by these neoliberal organizations with dubious and very shady background. And their agendas there is quite clear: destroying the national identity, destroying the Armenian church, and depriving Armenia of any foundation that could they resist against an attack from the Azerbaijani side. It's like a worm living inside your home. And unfortunately, many Armenians do not see it. I don't know how many people see it in Armenia, but they are re-electing Pashinyan. And I know that he is in full control of the state institutions and he can force many people to vote for him. But it's really, really sad to see this. Before I ask you the last question, Dr. Diesen, I would just like to tell the audience something very quick. This is a book, your book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian War, is in the description below. And this is the cover of the book, guys. If you want to purchase the book, I already put the links in the description below. You can order it from the United States and from Germany. This is a new book that Dr. Diesen has published, and in the cover photo you can see that Professor John Mearsheimer, he was also recommending his book. So if you're interested in reading the book, I have put the link in the description below. The X account of Glenn Diesen is in the description below, and also the Substack and also his YouTube channel. Last question, Dr. Glenn, since we're speaking about what's happening in Europe, and you realized that this week there was the revelations about the Nord Stream attack. And I asked AI to tell me what happened about this, and the AI says that the recent disclosures about the sabotage of the Nord Stream natural gas pipeline have sparked a heated dispute between Poland and Germany, two key U.S. allies. Poland's prime minister has demanded that German authorities apologize and keep quiet after a suspect allegedly crossed back into Ukraine without being arrested. This comes as Moscow has filed a complaint with Germany, citing a lack of progress in the investigation and requesting urgent talks on Germany's obligations in the fight against terrorism. I mean, there were articles in the German mainstream press, in the Welt, and others say that Germany will stop sending aid, and then Olaf Scholz came and said, no, we will continue supporting Ukraine as long as it takes. So do you see that Berlin is going to swallow this case? Is Germany going to accept the industrialization, or they're going to push back against the who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines?
Well, it's hard to say with Germany. They become like the key case of Stockholm syndrome, it seems, and it's become quite awkward. Obviously, the Germans asked the Poles to arrest the alleged Ukrainians who had blown up this pipeline, and as you pointed out, the Poles effectively, they didn't arrest them, let them go or flee. Made up excuses, and even told Germans to shut up and apologize for having Nord Stream to begin with. So I think this idea that there was some rogue Ukrainians on a sailboat, it's for me, it's also a very ridiculous suggestion. Obviously, the United States had to be involved in this, and most likely Poland had a finger in this as well. So it is strange, but obviously the German reaction is sad to be said. They don't stand up for their national interest anymore, and this is going to have a nationalist backlash at some point. Now, I think what was interesting with this new revelation, though, that when they posted in the Wall Street Journal that this was, where they named the names of all these people who were suspected of being behind it. What was quite interesting is, first of all, they mentioned Zelensky knew about this, and he had approved it, but then he tried to stop it. Again, it's I'm not saying I'm buying the story, but it's interesting that they named Zelensky being behind it, whatever that might mean. But it's also quite interesting that the Americans recognized that the CIA attempted to stop it, because they had because that confirms yet again that the Americans knew about this in advance. They knew that it was the Ukrainians who attacked. Allegedly, America didn't know anything, or no, allegedly they didn't have anything to do with it. But the reason why this is interesting is because they told the world thereafter they had nothing, that it was the Russians. Most likely, everything pointed Russians. This is why they intensified, they escalated the war in Ukraine. This is why they began to strengthen NATO patrols and dominance of the key seas like the Baltic Sea. They use this as a huge escalation based on what they now have confirmed was a lie, and they don't talk about this now. Well, what is Germany going to do? Well, first they suggested, well, these two issues are not linked. It's two separate issues. The Ukrainians attacking our critical infrastructure and the war in Ukraine, two separate things. We'll continue to arm them. But of course, all of this contributes to further splits in German society, because some people find this to be, well, let's say, humiliating, that they have to stand next to the Americans and then pretend as if they don't know who was behind it. And even a year ago, there was this article, I remember, in Washington Post, where they interviewed, or cited at least, a European diplomat who said, listen, we learned that the more we dig into this Nord Stream case, the less we like these things we see. So we just stopped asking questions. So because there was no good narrative, is it the Ukrainians or the Americans? We don't want to know, because neither of those answers are good if it's not Russia. So it just went down the memory hole. The obedient media doesn't report on it anymore. And but now, of course, with this story, it's yet again on top of the news. So it's what's Germany going to do? I think they're going to be loyal to the Americans. They might lash out a little bit against the Poles. They'll continue to send weapons in Ukraine. But within Germany, I think society is going to struggle, because their economy is not doing well. There's a political split. When you have a foreign minister who say, I'm going to continue sending weapons to Ukraine no matter what my voters say, how long can you really do this before these divisions begin to really go up to the surface and cause huge problems? And I think we're going to get there as well.
Dr. Diesen, I live in Germany, so I have to be careful with my words, since the government has become very paranoid with criticism. And I think you're very correct. The people are, I don't want to use the term radicalized, but they feel that they are being humiliated. An increasing number of people are voting for the Alternative for Germany, AfD, or for the Sarah Wagenknecht coalition. And the framings are ready. The press calls the AfD far-right neo-Nazis, and the Sarah Wagenknechts are the communists and the far left. So the accusations are ready, and Germans are very worried. They worry, and they are very careful with this type of accusations, because you could lose your job, your reputation, especially if you're working in the public sphere. So it's very difficult to discuss and push against these narratives, and you could lose your job, and you will suffer for the rest of your life, and you will be in an economic jail. This is how I see things in Germany. I hope that Germany would recover, its economy would recover. It would positively also impact me, because we're paying higher bills now, and the groceries are skyrocketing. It's crazy when you want to buy something from the groceries. So I would really love for Germany to recover from this. But until then, I would like to thank you, Dr. Glenn, for coming to the show. And I would like to thank you more, because I learned from you and I listened to you. And I would like, when I grow up, I would like to become an academic like yourself. That's why I respect you a lot, and also respect your thoughts and coming to the show and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with this audience of Syriana Analysis.
Thank you so much for those kind words.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Diesen. And thank you so much, guys, for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all. We're going to do another live streaming tomorrow, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.